It is always a good day when you get a new camera. So let's talk about it. So this is the Fujifilm X100VI. It is the successor to the wildly popular Fujifilm X100V, which I probably don't need to introduce to you if you are watching this video. I'm sure you're aware of that camera. It basically took the photography internet niche by storm, becoming really popular in the pandemic for this kind of almost quite tangible, just run and gun, point and shoot photography style, which I think had been kind of somewhat lost in the past. So this is the successor to that camera. So I've had the camera now for a couple of weeks, so I'm going to kind of share my experiences. I have a lot of experience with the Fujifilm X100 line. This is the X100T. I never actually owned the X100V, but I have shot with it. So I thought it would be also interesting to kind of give a perspective on whether you should think about upgrading if you previously have used one of these cameras, but of course also whether or not this line is actually worth considering if you're just thinking about getting into it in the first place. Alrighty, so let's talk about some of the things that I've enjoyed so far about shooting with this camera, and I think a lot of these are going to be relatively in line with kind of other experiences of the X100 line. There's nothing that's particularly unique to this model, but there are also improvements, general improvements in this model that are kind of going to help with the experience overall shooting with the line, because the X100 line is all about the experience of shooting photography. Because to be honest, I could take one of my more professional cameras, so this is the Sony a7 IV. It is, almost double in terms of price. This will run you about £2,500 here in the UK. This one is £1,500 or £1,600 here in the UK. But this camera pretty much does everything that this camera does, maybe with the exception of a couple of things like the kind of film emulation standards on the X100, but the form factor, design and experience is really what's different about it. You'll notice that some of the shots that I got yesterday, these kind of more like hip fiery shots, basically what I was doing was kind of holding the camera kind of mid-length. I was manual focusing, I was walking past subjects and snapping away as I was going. And the ability to be able to do that is kind of slightly impossible on a larger camera. You just kind of blend in with this form factor and design. People aren't noticing you, you just look like a kind of tourist. Whereas with a larger camera body, a larger setup, and also a louder shutter, you're just going to be noticed every single time. Not to mention there's just something absolutely beautiful about this camera line. They've kind of kept in standard with the kind of X100 Classic. Of course, the design is really no different. I've actually gone for black this time just to be a little bit more incognito, but you have this kind of film camera retro style that is obviously a massively popular thing. Fuji just keeps winning in the camera design section. Okay, so let's talk about film emulations. Obviously a very important aspect of the X100 line, or really any kind of Fujifilm cameras, is it lets you shoot with a selection of film emulations, and you can create your own recipes and variants of these film emulations. So you can really tailor the look of the style of image that you like to shoot if you want to just spit out JPEGs that you don't have to edit. This is a much faster and really nice way of shooting with the X100 line. If one of the main advantages of this camera line is kind of ease of use, just kind of getting photos that are ready to kind of share straight off the SD card, this is obviously a big advantage of that. I haven't really had the time to properly tweak my film emulation settings right now, so what I actually ended up doing is shooting JPEG RAW and then editing my favorite photos in Adobe Lightroom like I would normally do with all of my images. And I ended up using a selection of film emulations from really nice images. There's something I've been using a lot recently. They're absolutely beautiful. You can see some of the differences in before and afters for the type of thing I'm doing. I'll link these down below if you're interested, because they are really quite beautiful film emulations. They're quite expensive for what they are, but if you do a lot of photography work, like I do professional photography work, so they end up paying for themselves if you even use them on one job. But I think the film emulations are a massive reason why people continue to use this camera, as you can kind of get a beautiful look that is not just like a filter. Like, they are much more kind of scientific than a filter over your image, but you can really kind of mess around with the style and output of your images whilst you're not having to kind of edit each individual photograph from scratch every time. So like I said, I've kind of upgraded from a Fujifilm X100T, which is 3 generations back now for the X100 line. So with the T, then you have the X100F, then you have the X100V, and now obviously the 6. So the biggest difference for me so far, it definitely seems like, is the autofocus and also the kind of general image quality. There is also a new 40 megapixel sensor on this camera and is absolutely beautiful. I probably wouldn't end up using this in a professional environment, but I could now because the amount of data that you're getting from the raw file and also the kind of general size and sharpness of the image is just absolutely brilliant now. And another thing is the autofocus is dramatically improved. I know this is obviously from the T I'm talking about. I'm sure if you're coming from the X100V, the autofocus is still pretty good on that camera. I don't think there's going to been any progressive enhancements over the autofocus on the X100VI. But like I said, it did really impress me yesterday. It is definitely a bit of a learning curve to kind of figure out the best way that you like to use the autofocusing system on this camera. Have a play around with some of the settings, have a play around with some of the modes, and you'll find a system and a workflow that works for you. I do though have to admit that some of my best photos yesterday that I ended up shooting with this camera, like I said, kind of walking around almost like hip firing, were actually taken in manual focus. I was just sort of setting a manual focus of a couple of meters in front of me and then walking past people nice and slowly and able to capture some pretty cool special moments here. So something that is a dramatic improvement over the last generation of camera, over the X100V, is this camera has IBIS. So it's got in-body image stabilization, and that is kind of really good for a few reasons. First of all, if you shoot video, of course, with this camera, you're going to be able to shoot handheld video to a much higher standard than you would have done with the X100V. That's a big one, just if you happen to shoot video. It does shoot in 10-bit 422 video as well now, so you are getting like a kind of really capable video camera. But the IBIS is a big deal also for stills. So one of my personal favorite ways of shooting is with a long shutter, and that's obviously a real advantage now of this camera, is being able to drop the shutter speed down to lower levels because of the IBIS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame up here. I'm going to frame the shard. I'm going to pick a point and I'm going to wait for somebody to walk past. So being able to shoot with a low shutter speed on this camera now and kind of not have to worry about your actual kind of main subject being shaky or distorted in your photograph is obviously a big advantage. It does kind of open up and just another angle of street photography. I love personally shooting low shutter. I do it a lot. I think it's a beautiful way of kind of incorporating just a bit more motion into your images than you would normally get otherwise. So having that IBIS in the camera is actually really, really useful for me. So obviously on the channel here, I cover a lot of smartphone cameras. So I just want to talk briefly about the kind of advantages and thoughts and perspectives of someone who shoots photos with a smartphone a lot of the time, and the kind of advantages or differences of using a camera like this. So the first of all is the aperture, the depth of field capability. Because I think, to be honest, if I was to shoot things like landscapes or kind of cityscapes or architectural shots, there's not a lot of advantage of actually choosing a camera like this. You're going to get a pretty similar result that you would do out of a smartphone now. The sensors are so good. The advantages come when you are wanting to capture motion and also capture motion to a kind of a higher standard that you would get on a phone. So being able to do that type of kind of walking past shot, shooting drive mode, just take on a smartphone is almost impossible. And when you do get one of those shots, you're not going to get a nice creamy depth of field that you would otherwise get on something like this if you have people in the foreground. You can see that I've just got a nice shallow roll off in this image, whereas on a smartphone it just wouldn't look like this. And then of course another massive thing is that it's just the kind of tangible experience of shooting with a camera like this. It is just a fun experience. And I do personally think, even though I think smartphone cameras are amazing and I do love shooting with smartphone cameras, there's nothing that is more convenient than just having a fantastic camera in your pocket, but they are just not as fun to shoot with like this, and actually kind of getting down and in certain angles and waiting for a subject to walk through your frame. Like, it is just really fun. Alright, so you've made it to this point in the video. What's my overall kind of thoughts, opinions, experiences of shooting with this camera? Do I think it's worth the upgrade if you have one of the other Fujifilm X100 line? I think the first thing to say on this camera is that this line in general is so much fun, but it is a bit of a learning curve. I think the first time you take this camera out, you may well disappoint yourself with the photos that you are going to take. It's not that easy to use. You kind of have to find a style and a way to shoot with it it and kind of iron out the wrinkles as you go. You probably will end up taking a lot of photos you're not that happy with to start with, but things will slowly kind of start to improve. Have a look at kind of some kind of like best settings videos, that type of thing. That type of thing really helped me. And slowly but surely you'll start to take some fantastic images using this camera. I love the fact that it's pocketable. You can kind of just keep it like tucked away and is really kind of unobtrusive and doesn't get in the way of your daily kind of photography. I think if you are thinking about picking up one of these lines of cameras, the X100 is an incredible camera, and I think you should absolutely do it if you are interested in photography in general. I do have to admit, I don't necessarily think the X100VI is a camera you need to go for. I think if you can get a better price on the X100V or even the X100F, it might be worth exploring. I think the T is probably a little bit outdated now, to be honest. Things like the autofocus is just a bit slow, that type of thing. I think really, unless you shoot a lot of video, you don't necessarily need the 6, to be honest. The sensor on the X100V is top class, even though it's been improved in this model as well. They've obviously kept a lot of what made the X100V successful in this camera, but it definitely kind of raises the question of like, is it worth spending the extra money on, which I think is a valid question. If you have the V, you should absolutely not think about upgrading. You're probably really happy with that camera as the first place. I think really this one comes down to price and what's right for you. If you can find a V priced at a roughly affordable kind of rate, and certainly there are probably going to be them now that the 6 is out, I would consider looking into that camera, but otherwise the X100VI is a hell of a camera.